welcome everybody to our panel. This is essentially a panel on economics and business in Africa. We set up this panel because we believe that business and economics are at the center of African studies, especially from an European perspective, dating back historically. And so we think it's important to shine some light on business and economics. So what we've done is to set up the call for papers along these lines, showing historically that the whole interest of Europe in Africa is linked to business and economics. And so it will be important to probe the dynamics of these kinds of constructs and the kind of institutions that have emerged over the years to determine or to shape how these businesses have flowed, have developed over time. We have collected a nice set of papers, which I'm sure Solomon will explain in a minute, explain these papers. And of course, Solomon will be chairing today's session. And then towards the end, Abel will take over the chairing of the session. So Solomon will explain that in a minute. And at this stage, all I can do is to wish everybody a very good and fantastic conference.
Thank you, Uche, for the opening remarks. Okay, so we have got a varied number of papers spanning from monetary union to market liberalization and some kind of CO2 emissions, and talking about the environment and talking about financial regulation in terms of capital markets in general. So that's the kind of framework of papers that we are expecting to be discussed in the next 2 hours or so. We have 4 papers in total, and given that we have about 2 hours, we would anticipate that everybody would have close to 20-25 minutes, give or take. And presenters would typically present for about 15 minutes, and then if you stop after 15 minutes, we have around about 10 minutes for questions, answers, and discussion to go through that. Once you start to present, when you hit about 10 minutes and you have 5 minutes to go, I would notify you. And if anybody has a question, you can either raise your hand or you can type it in the chat box, and then the presenters will respond to them thereafter. After the first 2 papers, we might have about 5 minutes for everybody to either get coffee or go to the washroom or any number of things that you would like to do. And then we will continue with the rest of the remaining 2 papers. The order of papers is that Oke and Uche would start with their monetary union paper in French West Africa, followed by Abel and Augustine, who would talk about multinational corporations and climate change in general for the first 1 hour. And after that, we would jump into political liberalization and markets in South Africa. And then I will then conclude the session with financial market regulation and capital market regulation in Africa in general. Yeah, so that's the order of the papers. At some point, Uche might like to leave, getting to the end. Uche might like to leave, so keep that in mind. Uche, if that's not urgent and you still want to stay, not a problem. But if you have to excuse yourself, please do.
So that's fine. I think let's go. I think I'll stay. It's okay.
Okay. So without much ado, Uche and Oke would present their paper first. I don't know whether you have rights to be able to share your screen, or if you have some presentation.
I should be able to. Let's see.
Okay.
Then I can send you the slides and see.
Okay. No, you can just share your screen. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So Uche, you have we are starting 10:15 exactly. You have until 10:30 to present, and then we have 10 more minutes after that for.
Okay. That's good. Thank you, Solomon, and for this opportunity to present my paper. Essentially, this is a paper that I've been working on with Oke Ndubweze, who is also around, and so I'm presenting this on his behalf. Oke has done all the work. My job is just to present, and I'm sure he will answer the questions. So essentially, we're looking at from the paper I started from CFA Frank Tedieko, but the French connection. As a background to the paper, in 2019, the 8 Francophone West African countries announced that they were going to leave the CFA franc and adopt the ECO as their single currency. This was clearly supported by France, and the Anglophone West African countries, or the remaining of West Africa, essentially cried foul because the ECO was actually a currency that was supposed to be adopted by all these West African countries in 2020. It was supposed to be adopted gradually based on those, first by those who meet the convergence criteria that they set. So when they announced this suddenly, and at that time, most of the countries, CFA franc countries, had not achieved the convergence criteria, then they cried foul that this was against, that they had monopoly on the title, on the name, the ECO. And so the support of France, France supported this, and essentially the question we're asking today, what is the connection of France in all this? Why should France support this kind of move? And to do this, essentially what we've done a simple outline. First, we'll look at ECOWAS and UEMOA. Then we'll look at the optimum currency area theory. Then the next one, we'll look at monetary integration in British and French West Africa. And then we'll look at ECOWAS-wide monetary integration program. And then we'll look at France and the change to the ECO, or the connection of France to the change to the ECO. So we have 15 minutes to present this. So we will be quite quick in doing this. So essentially, if you look at ECOWAS and UEMOA, UEMOA simply means West African Economic and Monetary Union. So that's the acronym, the French acronym. So essentially, if you look at West Africa, for instance, and which UEMOA is a subset, what do you see? You see very poor, it's a very poor, one of the poorest subcontinents, widespread conflict, poor infrastructure. And this one, I think is quite important, low intra-regional trade. And we will explain this in the future. So as we will see, this is quite important when you talk about optimum currency area. So this is kind of what you see in West Africa. Then you look at the optimum currency area theory, essentially. This was essentially developed by Professor Mundell. And one of the arguments is that it is easier, it makes sense for countries to come together, adopt a single currency if it leads to lower transactions costs. And of course, it gives such countries in their unit larger markets, access to larger markets. Okay, so that's the optimum currency theory. But then such countries have to weigh this against the possibility, the fact that they may lose monetary policy independence. So if you come in, each country will no longer have the right or the tools to tackle economic, macroeconomic problems when it comes. So, so there's a clear, countries have to strike a balance on how to approach this. And what are the assumptions of this, for this to hold? For instance, the assumption is that there should be free movements of goods and free movement of labor, okay? And then there should also be common external tariffs, that is essentially having a clear customs union. And then there should be high levels of intra-regional trade. So these are necessities for you to achieve a meaningful optimum currency area. Of course, the best example we have is the European Union with 19 countries, many still waiting to join. And of course, we also have examples of dollarization, where some countries have essentially adopted the dollar, some unilaterally, because to get some kind of monetary stability, not necessarily in agreement with the US. And such countries include Ecuador, and of course we know of El Salvador. That is also one of the countries that have done this. We'll now look at monetary integration in British and French West Africa. And essentially the argument is that this is all linked to colonization. Okay, so the flag and businesses moved together. So businesses attracted colonization. Okay, this is well established in economic history in West Africa. And this whole colonization was essentially driven by trade, and that is well established. Okay, so, and one of the first things the colonial masters, French and the British that mainly colonized West Africa, did was to demonetize local currencies and set up central currencies, one for the French zone and one for the English British zone. And this is here you see the optimum currency area coming. So essentially creating larger markets, reducing transactions costs of these currencies. So in West Africa, for instance, the West Africa Currency Board was established in 1912, okay, for 4 countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and I think the Gambia. And the CFA franc zone, for instance, was linked to the French franc in 1945. So, but at independence, the French and the British diverged in the attitude towards post-colonial states. Okay, and this is where the divergence began. The British allowed their post-colonial states to establish their independent central banks and then led to the collapse of the West African Currency Board. But the French didn't do quite that. They essentially established the BCIO, the Central Bank of French West African States, and encouraged their post-colonial countries to join this. And they had strong connections with that and still linked their currency to the French. So it was a kind of, and that led to accusations of neo-colonialism from modern scholars on this. Okay, and to show you the attitude of the French country, you can consider what happened to Guinea, Mali, Togo, and Ivory Coast when they tried to leave. Guinea, for instance, in 1958, voted for total independence from France. De Gaulle ordered the removal of, as it was said, everything from the country, including electric bulbs. Those who know Guinea know they never recovered from this till the death of Sékou Touré, and they're still recovering. In Mali, for instance, in the 1960s, the then president wanted to establish a local currency, briefly pulling out of the CFA franc zone. That led to his overthrow and death. He was also killed. No, sorry, he was detained and died in detention. In Togo, Sylvanus Olympio was assassinated in 1963 because it is argued that he tried to also establish his own local currency. The problems of Gbagbo in Ivory Coast has also been linked by some scholars to his voicing of his interest in establishing a local currency. We know that he was detained in The Hague and was just freed recently. Okay, so even after the CFA, then in 1999, the CFA franc was also linked to the euro, so continuing this linkage. Okay, and then the conditions were simple: half of the reserves to be held in France, so as part of the way of guaranteeing this stability. And then France was represented on the board of the BCIO and had a veto power, in fact, on the board of the BCIO. Okay, so the problem of those linkages could be seen in when France devalues its currency. That simply means such unilateral actions also impact on French West African countries. That happened in 1948, for instance, with a lot of negative consequences. In 1994, we also saw the importance of France when it wasn't possible, despite the difficulties the Francophone countries had. They had to, they could only devalue, they all came together to devalue their currency by 50%. That could only happen with the support of France, by France giving them a lot of development aid and cancelling their debts so that they could all be on the same hymn book, on the same page of the hymn book. But I think one of the important things that we saw while doing this research was President Pompidou's observation in 1972. And essentially he argued that, look, the major problem was that there was a divergence between there was an increasing divergence between what African countries got for the natural resources which they depended on and the finished product. And unless that this was solved, African countries had no chance of ever competing or ever surviving in any meaningful way in the modern world.
Okay, you have about 5 minutes.
Okay. So monetary integration, no, you can, 5 minutes. No, that's not correct. I started 20. Okay.
You started about 15, so.
Okay.
You've been talking for about 10 minutes.
I just extended by 2 minutes and taking it.
Yeah.
Monetary integration in ECOWAS. Okay, so we look at that in ECOWAS. That, of course, started before the establishment of ECOWAS in 1975. We know that the Association of African Central Banks advised for the setting up of a West African Clearing House in 1975. That failed because Nigeria refused to put its oil sales into the West African Clearing House basket. Interestingly, Nigeria was behind the establishment of ECOWAS with the sole objective of reducing the influence of France in the region after the collapse after the Nigerian Civil War. We know in 1987, the ECOWAS Monetary Cooperation Program started. But if you look at the contradiction of Ghana, which is encircled by you and more, Ghana, there were a lot of discussions and debates, and Ghana eventually decided it made no sense for them to be teaming up with Nigeria, which they had no borders with when they were encircled by Francophone countries. Okay, so, but Ghana essentially decided to stay with Nigeria. Of course, there were some colonial influence that I'm aware of. In 1999, for instance, they decided to, okay, when it was clear that they couldn't form a simple zone, they said, okay, let's form two zones, the West African Monetary Zone, then by the non-UMOA countries. And in 2001, that was supposed to be merged with the CFA franc zone, but we know that never happened. And it was not until 2015 they said, okay, let's return to a single monetary zone direct that will take place in 2020, adopting the ECO. Again, as I explained, that also didn't happen. It was in 2019 that CFA franc countries unilaterally announced the change, okay, to ECO. So France, what does France have to do with this change? For us to understand this, let's look at the trading patterns. Essentially, we've tried to link trade, and I think this is one of the most important slides we have, or the next two slides. If you look at this, is export trades, for instance, from CFA franc countries. And you can see that France in the 60s was dominant. A lot of the export went to France, but you can see that has gradually declined, and that is now in the single digits. And also, you will look at, if you look at CFA franc trade, it also has always remained in the single digits export. And also trade with China has always remained in the single digits. But it now gets more interesting when you look at imports. The same attitude in the 60s, again, it was high with France. That gradually declined to the 20s, to the 10s. Okay, then if you look at CFA franc, intra-CFA franc imports, that is now in the 20s, so not much. So you see this concept, this kind of region can never achieve an optimum currency area with this kind of levels of low trade. But then the new kid in the block is China, and you can see that that is rising, and it's now going towards 50%. Okay, so China is essentially overtaking France in the CFA franc countries. Okay, so so possible reasons why for France. Why is France supporting why is France supporting this change to CFA franc from CFA franc to the ECO? Just unilateral change. One reason is that they're doing it to undermine the economic ECOWAS Monetary Cooperation Program, okay, to bring British West Africa under its control. And essentially, one of the arguments is that, look, this is linked to Macron's new policy of Ambition Africa program. Okay, but clearly this doesn't make sense. This is given in the literature, but we argue, me and okay, we argue that this doesn't make sense, as it is obvious Nigeria will definitely oppose this. And in any case, and CFA franc has in any case not benefited from French trade, and there's very little French trade. So this is unlikely to be the reason. The second reason we're looking at is that has also been advanced in the literature is that this is to stem the rising influence of China in Africa. Again, how they will do this, we find it difficult to understand because China is now the larger trader in CFA franc in Francophone West African countries. China is even bigger in Anglophone West African countries. So there's also evidence that China is cooperates with France in Africa, especially in areas where they cooperate in China. Like for instance, in the train industry, in the train building industry, for instance. So we do not think that this is the real reason. And that brings us to what we think the real reason is. And that's the possible third reason. And this is what we advance as the reason, okay, and myself have advanced, that France essentially wants to end this CFA franc engagement in Africa, which has been damaging its image in the continent, because this is seen as the last vestige of neocolonialism. And if you look at the trade, it's benefiting nothing from this whole arrangement. So, so why should they continue to get all these bad names? And they realize that if you leave West African countries on their own, this will never materialize. We've seen them postpone the date for this single currency. So this new ECO arrangement creates an opportunity for France to force UMOA countries to adopt the ECO. Okay, in that way, they know that over time the whole thing will collapse, because we know, for instance, that the Anglophone countries will never be admitted into this ECO, because for that to happen under the European rules, they need the European Parliament. They need the permission of the European Parliament to do that, and that is unlikely going to happen. So we know that. So if you force them into the ECO, and of course, one of the things they have done is to say, okay, we will no longer be represented on will no longer be represented on the BCR, board of the BCRO, and also you don't have to keep majority of your reserves again in France. So we are now getting out of it. So that we think is the best strategy. If they can get them, then over time, as these countries run into fiscal problems, then gradually they will be unable to reconcile their fiscal positions. Then they will gradually, this whole ECO will collapse. And that will also free France from blame of this new colonial blame. Thank you very much, Solomon.
Thank you, Uche. We will now take some questions from the floor. You can either raise your hand, or you can type your question in.
Okay.
So maybe I go first, but whilst I wait, if anybody wants to jump in first, but then whilst I wait for people to raise their hands or type the chat, let me ask Uche a few questions. So Uche, thank you for your presentation, but you also make a very strong argument, not only regarding West Africa currency union, but currency unions across the world in general, right? So at some point in time, when the Eurozone was struggling and people wondered whether or not the Euro should have even existed in the first place, to look for solutions in which monetary union has, or currency union has survived and thrived over time. People even argued that the West Africa CFA was an example of a currency union that seemed to be much more successful, and therefore the European Union or the Eurozone should have taken some lessons from them. Now it turns out to be the opposite. Yeah, so it turns out to be the opposite. So what is your intuition about, is it more about the functioning of a currency union system, or is more about the embeddedness of the colonial power behind its function?
Well, I think two of them go hand in hand. I mean, essentially what we tried to show from the trade graphs was that colonial power behind the function essentially established a currency union that was aimed at trading with the colonial partner rather than amongst themselves. Clearly, so you can see that the so-called stability CFA franc countries have had that maybe endangered the position you mentioned, where people say, oh, this is a clear example. Of course, that is nonsensical. I mean, you have very low trade amongst yourself in the single digits. And essentially your trade was mainly with France. And then as the French trade disappeared, other partners came on board in terms of, you saw it, for instance, in terms of imports, China took over. In terms of export, you had countries like maybe Singapore, UAE, China, China, and even India, especially for the north of these countries. So clearly that made no sense. But the whole stability was achieved because of the linkage with the CFA franc and later with the euro. But then what did that stability mean for West Africa? It meant no development, okay, essentially. So that, in our view, essentially benefited maybe the ruling class and their associates, so they could have a stable currency to do their transactions, maintain their expensive Western habits. But in terms of local development, improving agriculture, building local value chains, that did not happen.
Yeah, I believe so as well. Hey, Tom?
Yeah, I'm full of questions, but that's also partly based on my complete ignorance. A very simple question to start with. This name ECO, where does it come from?
It essentially came from ECOWAS, but it was essentially adopted by the ECOWAS countries as the name that the ECOWAS-wide currency will use. ECOWAS-wide for the ECOWAS-wide currency.
Okay.
But in 2019, it was hijacked by the CFA franc countries, and they converted to the ECO.
Yeah. Then if I follow your reasoning, now first let me ask: did ECO was it already established as a currency, or is it still a plan?
Pure plan. It's on the paper.
Okay, and what is the intention? When do they want to say to collapse the CFA franc and go to the ECO?
Well, I think they announced that it will take place from 2020. What has happened is that in the French House of Representatives, they've already passed the legislation, and many of the African countries have also already passed the legislation for this to happen. So, and also for you to know that there's a French connection in this. It's the Central African, for the Central African countries under French control too. Mm-hmm. They've also announced that they're going to adopt a similar strategy. So it's certainly centrally controlled.
Okay, Solomon, can I continue with asking basically two questions?
Yes, I haven't seen anyone raise
the whole thing.
We can continue. Somebody raise their hand or type a question.
Okay. One is, if I follow your reasoning, then it's a very cynical reasoning. Eh? You say France simply withdraws from all of this. The result will be the collapse of the ECO when the ECO will be established, and then there will be chaos. So for me, if that is France's strategy, then the only one who will really benefit from that strategy will be China, because then China has come to the rescue of these various parts of the ECO zone to make at least the currencies work again. And that can't be France's intention. So I wonder what is what is behind this cynicism?
No, I think essentially what has happened in recent days, if you look at it in France, across West Africa, there have been demonstrations against this French neo-colonial control, and this CFA franc is seen as the last vestige of neo-colonialism. Okay, so what is happening is that the technocrats in Paris are asking themselves, we get so much bad name from this CFA franc, and then what are the benefits? And I showed you the graph. In terms of trade benefits, there is very little. And increasingly, it is also becoming clear to France that they can no longer control the political dynamics in West Africa. We've seen French-supported governments fall. We saw that in Burkina Faso, for instance. We saw that in Mali. Okay, so they are no longer in a position to change. So how then do they move forward? And one way essentially to move forward will be to say, okay, look, let us get rid of this last vestige of new colonialism, even if we help to prop this country. But the important thing is let us disconnect from the CFA franc. And one of the ways to disconnect is to, one, leave the BCIO board, and two, lose their veto power in the BCIO board. The third way to disconnect, of course, that they are still maintaining, is guaranteeing the stability of the CFA franc or the ECO. And now our argument is this: that will continue even if it translates to the ECO. But then what that means is that over time, France will now be in a position to pick and choose which countries it will allow to live, it can let go to leave the union, assuming they run into these high deficit problems, financial deficit problems.
Okay.
Because it no longer keeps its
Then finally moving to the higher level, the 1st of January was the start of the Africa Free Trade Area. And there's a lot of debate about it in Africa itself, hardly anything in Europe, I find. But in Africa itself, there are some people who even suggest this is the start, say, in 10 years' time, to an African currency. So will this not be just a phase where then the ECO and its collapse will demand an African currency at a much higher scale, and then based on the hopefully successful free trade area? Or is this very optimistic?
No, we share a totally different view on free trade than you. And I think our view on free trade is simple, right? If you look at the Africa Free Trade Agreement, we look at it from who is pushing for this free trade, really? I mean, where people can't move across borders freely. Who is pushing for this free trade? And essentially, who is pushing for it? It's essentially external parties. China, the European Union, they are pushing for this free trade because it's easier. Again, it comes to this optimum currency thing. It's easier to deal with Africa as one unit than to deal with 54 independent small countries. So if you can push for it, and this is clear, how are they pushing for it? They push for it through the African Union, they push for it through the Africa Development Bank. And how are they able to do this? If you look at the African Union, 60–70% of their budget is funded from the outside. If you look at their headquarters was built by the Chinese. And I mean, if you're an organization funded extensively from the outside, whose interest are you protecting? If you look at the African Development Bank, that is not a bank; it's an aid agency. It has 3 windows: the Nigerian Trust Fund, which is nearly bankrupt, has then the main African Development Bank, which is clearly on the decline, and then but the main fund is the African Development Fund, which is by foreign countries. That is actually where the money is, and that takes care of about 60% or more of their whole expenditure. So essentially, they have the drivers to move through these organizations to fund it. So we do not believe that this whole concept of Africa Free Trade Agreement is all a ruse. It's not designed for Africa.
Okay, that's quite a point of view. Okay, I give the floor back to Solomon.
Abel has a question for you, Uche. Abel is asking for you to elaborate on the argument that France supported the move, but this move is likely more like a threat to the current West African Monetary Union. And what's your take on that? Is it a threat or not?
A threat to who? No, I don't see how it is a threat.
To France.
So a threat to France. No, I don't see how it will be a threat to France. You understand? Essentially, what it does, it gives France. I mean, France is in a quagmire in West Africa. Okay, this CFA franc has destroyed its reputation. It's seen as a neo-colonialist power. Okay, so I don't see how it will be. What it does, essentially, it will give France the ability to choose which countries in West Africa, in Francophone West Africa, it can easily ease off and allow to leave the monetary zone, the eco-monetary zone, by refusing to support their linkage to the euro. That's what I think. I don't see it as a threat to France in any way. It just gives them more leverage to operate in this environment. Okay, so the key for France is to leave this whole vestige of neo-colonialism, and we have shown through the trade that France benefits very little from this trade.
Okay, so on that note, we have almost exhausted all of our...
But France could have done that, supporting a West African-wide monetary agreement.
Yes, France can do that, but we also know that Nigeria will never agree. We know Nigeria will never agree. One, we know Nigeria will never agree, and secondly, since France is now part of the European Union, Europe is unlikely to grant that permission, because that permission to admit new members into CFA franc zone will require the permission of the European Parliament, and we know it is unlikely that will happen.
Yeah, and if I may just add also 2 additional things on this argument. There's also the issue that the Nigerian, the bloc, the English bloc, Nigeria, Ghana, that they favor a floating currency. So the type of the currency the Nigeria favors the floating currency as against pegging the currency to the euro. So the whole arrangement will complicate matter for France. And also the pressure of France increasingly spending a lot of money on conflict resolution in West Africa. Because recently France has been spending loads of money that they can no longer justify. So weighing what they are getting out of Africa, West Africa, and the amount of money they are spending, especially in terms of security, is becoming completely unjustifiable, we think, for them to keep the status quo.
My network appears to be very poor. It's a bit more efficient on my phone, and having a little problem trying to share from the phone. But I can just start the discussion while I try sharing the slides. Our topic is on multinational companies and the rhetorics of climate change and sustainable development, looking at it from a cement production perspective in Nigeria. And our goal is to examine how we campaign for climate change and in Africa. And we're going to look at from trying to answer provide answers to a central question in our discussion is what drives multinationals' commitments in climate change and sustainable development in Africa? Sorry, I'm still trying to share my slides. The network in my laptop is a bit very unstable. Sorry about that. So we look at four major factors that exist in literature as to why multinational companies show commitments to climate change, and one of such is the strength of the host institution, as well as the profit drive by the multinational companies. We also have the fact that multinational companies sometimes have to keep to some international protocols that expect them to keep to certain level of environmental standards. And then, of course, the issue of corporate citizenship. Generally, our hypothesis has to do with the fact that in institutionally weak jurisdictions, multinational companies sacrifice the environment for their profit drive. They tend to focus more on exploring cheaper means of production, regardless of the extent of damage would have on the environment. And our argument is that it doesn't necessarily matter whether it is local or foreign multinational. It doesn't matter whether it's local or foreign multinational. The findings arising from our paper reveal that both local and foreign multinationals are guilty of, this idea of pushing for cheaper means of production that undermine the well-being of the environment. And then our paper outline, we laid a background for examining this issue we have raised. We also theorized around the concept of third-party costs and the transferability of third-party costs. And then we look at since we're examining the Nigerian context, we look at the strength of regulatory frameworks in the country, and then we take a foreign multinational that is like I said as part of the introduction, that for multinational companies would always want to reduce their costs by getting involved in means of production that permit such. And we know that in certain industries, getting to do that might mean, sacrificing some level of environmental well-being. And this is especially the case with, in institutionally weak environment where huge third-party costs arise from the operations of multinational companies. And these third-party costs reflect in terms of, climate change, different climate change risks. And the situation in Africa appears to be worse amongst other developing countries because of the overwhelming level of low capacity of these countries to mitigate and manage climate change risks, and then the limited public awareness as to the risks associated with climate change. And then we have this orientation of businesses generally, particularly the multinational companies, due to the colonial history of business in the region. And then we have the lack of transferability of third-party costs. As we move on, we get to understand this concept of third-party costs and how it drives the commitments or affects the commitments of multinational companies to climate change mitigation. Lack of capacity, the right political will also to control these multinational companies has also reflected visibly in the literature. And that is all because these multinational companies in some of these jurisdictions in Africa are seen as national benefactors contribute.
Yeah, so given that people is encountering some challenges maybe we switch to a different paper, and then he comes back much later to complete his submission.
Okay, so Mr. Chairperson, can I go ahead?
Yes, you can go ahead. You can go ahead. You have until about 11:30. So first 15 minutes for presentation, and then we have another 10 minutes for discussion.
Okay. So good day, everybody. I'm happy to be here, of course, and also to interact with you as colleagues. My paper, of course, is much longer than I could present, and the same goes for you. So what I thought was to just give some of the key elements of my paper in the form of a talk rather than a major PowerPoint presentation. It is also a work in progress. How did it start? I've been doing research on President Jacob Zuma, who has ruled South Africa from 2009 until 2018. I've been doing research on him for some years, and I thought that for this conference it may be interesting to zoom in and to look at the narratives, political and business related narratives that have been operating in South Africa under his government, and to say, okay, what does this mean for the markets there, and especially not only for the exchange mechanisms of markets, but for the symbolic metapolitical domain in which markets have to operate there. I do this in the paper. I first say that in my opinion, under Zuma, South Africa has changed in its political dynamics, going from what I would call a democracy with deficits or weaknesses to a hybrid regime, something that we see in other regional states, where the executive presidency combined with one-party dominance over time, combined with selective patronage, combined with a real element of intimidation and sometimes political assassinations, that these interact with democratic institutions and elections, producing a hybrid regime, which doesn't work completely like a democracy would. And secondly, that in his time, the political playing fields and the business playing fields have changed. To the extent they are no longer level. You can't just enter there. It is a very uneven playing field for businesses, both local and international. And the narratives that were used by Zuma and his small circle, his closest allies, those interested me. Which narratives did he use? What purpose did they play? And to what extent were they valid if one looks back at the record? Talk is cheap. Rhetoric, all politicians are supposed to be quite good at that. But what in the end do they achieve in the process? And this was what I wanted to look at. First, to understand what were the narratives. Now, these narratives were, of course, in my mind, not falling out of the sky. They were designed for political and business ends. For that purpose, they used previous discourses. And I discussed the narratives, not at length because we had a word limit, but I touched on a few of them, and I'll do so now too. Now, you'll know that the ANC, the African National Congress, came to power in 1994. Nelson Mandela was the leader. He was succeeded by Thabo Mbeki, and then the government of Jacob Zuma started in 2009. And it is this period, 2009 and 2018, that my paper covers. I first look at the National Democratic Revolution. That's a narrative inside the ANC, the ruling ANC. It basically says that we are not just exchanging power. We haven't just moved from, let's say, National Party rule in 1994 to ANC rule, but we also want to go to certain power centers in society and dominate those. And these power centers include the state-owned entities, So not only dominated because they are the government in power, but dominated by the party. So state-owned entities was one center of power. They have now been brought under complete party control through what they call cadre deployment. They deploy people from the party there and they dominate the institution. But other centers that were identified were the central bank. That has not succeeded until now. And when Zuma came to power, the ANC decided, no, we must also dominate the private sector. The National Democratic Revolution also has to run through the private sector. And as you know, South Africa's private sector in relation to, or the power relationship between the private sector and the government, historically, if you compare that to some other African countries, is quite strong. So this was a deliberate decision taken when Zuma came to power. How did he do that? First of all, he deployed cadres in the civil service, of course, in the state-owned entities. And he also used this as a tool of patronage. You know, the civil service has really expanded tremendously under Zuma. So quite successfully, he has turned this into a machine of patronage, of course, reinforcing his political power. The second thing that happened was that the traditional orientation under Mandela of South Africa trying to fulfill a semi-independent role.
Your slide is stuck. We're still on the first slide, so unless you have more slides that we are seeing now.
There's only one slide that I use, one with a blue hole in the middle.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. So talking around that. So when the ANC came to power under Mandela had a policy of not aligning with one actor exclusively, but trying to balance South Africa's foreign policy between the interest of South Africa in Europe and the South African interest in China and Russia and the rest of Africa and so on. Under Zuma, what happened was that many European actors, there was an interaction there. Many European actors were not very happy with his political and economic policies. So the relations became a bit more chilly. And in response, but also because the preferences of the ANC were there, relations with China and Russia especially improved a lot. And that meant that Zuma, even if he would be able to, even if he would lose some political power and influence in South Africa, he would often turn to, not to Europe or the United States, but turn to China, and not just periodically. In the end, he would identify China as the lodestar, the ideological guide, the beacon for South Africa's development policies. In the case of Russia, I didn't put in here a picture of him with Putin. In the case of Russia, he had actually quite a close relationship with Mr. Putin. Remember, Zuma, during the guerrilla struggles, was an intelligence head. He was trained outside of South Africa by Russian and East German operatives at the time. We had the Soviet Union. And as an intelligence head, of course, he could also, in professional terms, relate to Mr. Putin, who also came from that world. So at some stage, for example, there were claims that Zuma was poisoned by his one wife. They didn't say it was because of the cooking. And so he had to go to, he first went to Russia to be treated. So you see this pattern also. Then the third one, and it meant that China and Russia gained favorable terms, which some European countries no longer did. For example, in investor rights, the bilateral treaties with European countries were cancelled, but those with Russia and China continued. Third element that you would so see is that there was a huge distrust between the ANC developing, not all in the ANC, but some in the ANC and those closest to Zuma, a distrust developing between the business community, or parts of the business community, and parts of the ANC, especially those around Zuma. And this reflected in the responses by European and United States business associations in South Africa, where they said, okay, guys, we are seeing a multitude of regulations and laws. The end effect of all these laws and regulations are, first of all, that investor rights and property rights are watered down, and secondly, that that the private sector's autonomy is really shrinking now. So this was a change in the nature of the market, of the rules of the game in the market, in terms of the rise of intelligibility, what is possible to do in the political economy of South Africa. My paper also covers several other elements. You're welcome to ask questions about it, but I think the other thing that struck me was, in addition to the politics of patronage, was the role of crony capitalists, so people who were empowered by Black empowerment policies. But not all Black businessmen were empowered by this. It was a very selective circle and selected circle of people who actually profited the most. So somebody asked me, okay, if the Black empowerment legislation was there, why was it necessary for trade and industry officials behind closed doors to threaten businesses, basically? That if they don't give certain concessions, if they don't give certain tenders, if they don't give certain contracts, there will be reputational risks for them outside. Their name will be blackened. Why was this necessary if there was Black empowerment legislation? And the reason is, no, it wasn't all Black business people that were profiting from it. It was especially ANC aligned Black business people that were profiting, and not all of them, only those close to Zuma or close to certain powerful people in the ANC. So it was a politically partisan policy. Moletsi Mbeki, the brother of the former president, also wrote about that. And that really, of course, distorted the market, if you want. It created a new playing field that was very partisan, very much based on relational contracting with political partisanship in there. I mentioned something about the traditional authorities. As you know, in South Africa, we have 11 plus cultural groups. Among 9 of them, there are traditional authorities that have been there for decades, sometimes created by colonial authorities, but also sometimes predating colonial authorities. And at present, there are about 800 of them. Some of them have huge pieces of land under their authority, land that contains minerals. So there's this interaction between traditional authorities, government officials, politicians, and business people, local ones and international ones. And what happened under Zuma was that in the ANC, there was always this, and still is, this tension between modernism and traditional authorities. Mandela achieved a good balance between this. He also was a part of the traditional authorities of his clan, but he managed to balance this with, let's say, a more modernist or African modernist approach. But Mbeki, if anything, steered away from the traditional authorities. You could always sense that. One of the pictures I removed there, that's why there's a blue hole in the middle. But I wanted to illustrate something with that too. But it's a picture of Mbeki sitting with traditional authorities, and you can just sense from the body language and the clothes how uncomfortable he is with that. So this tension in the ANC has always played out, also in the repertoire of actions and the rhetoric. And in the case of Zuma, what you see is a man, he's married to 5 wives, he has about 20 children, he's very happy to engage with traditional authorities, as you can see in the one slide. He's standing in front of a traditional Zulu icon, Shaka Zulu. He feels very comfortable in that world, and he's able to connect to poor rural people, poor traditional authorities, or richer ones in a very good way. Now, if you look at the business media during his time in office, you could see the same discomfort, ambivalence, ambiguity when they had to deal with Zuma's traditional heritage. Now, in South Africa, there are many people, I myself included, I'm a bit of a relativist for my sins. I don't care, if that's his preference. But in business media, you could see this ambivalence. How can we have a president? We have to pay for 5 wives. He's not following all the modernist rules of the game, and so on.
You should be wrapping up now. We're almost running out of time.
Okay, thank you. So when Zuma started losing support, also ANC support, also support to, let's say, more redistributionist movement like the economic freedom fighters, he turned to the traditional authorities. When he came into the ANC, he said, I will be your man. And he became ever more their man in politics. He was willing to grant them concessions, to recognize them more, to increase their salary. So all of this, and the other aspects that I cover in my paper, point for me to one thing: the narratives, but also the rules of the game, the incentive systems of the markets under Zuma changed. They changed significantly. It's a different political economy compared to the time under Mandela or under Mbeki. And I think investors have responded to that in a certain way, often negatively. But it has been an experiment, and we'll have to perhaps evaluate. Is that the way that we want to go with more liberalization or decolonization in South Africa? Because there will be consequences, whichever route you take. But under Zuma, he took a specific route, and we also have the consequences of the specific route visible.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. I would now like to open the floor for questions. If you have a question, you can either type it or you can raise your hand. So thank you for your paper, and I would like more to reflect on the scope of your paper and to ask whether more the narrative is to look at the commercialization of an individual person and to what extent that individual can play a strategic role in the development of a political economy. We've seen examples across the world. We've seen success stories, but also failures. We've seen Nicolas Maduro as an example, a clear example of take it or leave it, whether it's a failure or it's a success, depending on how you look at it. We've seen the guy from what's his name, Rwanda, Kagame has a very success story that the political economy is framed. The framing of it is around this one individual character. And that seems to have more, on the one hand, a positive story, but on the other hand, some kind of critique that the character of the person is flown more into the economy as a whole. So I would like to ask, is your argument centered more on the marketization of the individual and to what extent that can flow into the political economy, or it's more on the way that the institutional framing of South African political economy, that it leaves so much room to one person to be able to dominate the entire space, and therefore maybe we should take some clue on the institutional setup as opposed to the individual setup?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question, and I don't think it is that clear, but I would say that both aspects we can discuss. The first is the person. Now, Zuma, even in his struggle days, clearly had a problem. He was always very popular. He still is. He's a nice guy. He has a great sense of humor. He can really interact with his audience. He can make everybody feel special and at home. He's very good at that. He's always had financial problems throughout his career. He doesn't know how to manage money very well. That's not his strength, right? And we all have our weaknesses, and that's his too. The second thing is that he has 5 wives. If you have one wife, you will know that has an effect on your local budget, right? And the wives may say the same thing about their husbands, right? But the point is, he has 5 wives. He has to let them live in style. So that is an issue. The third thing is that if you to take Zuma's cabinet style, management style, what do you see? You see a guy, he doesn't read the dossier. He uses patronage and some form of authority to intimidation to keep his people in line. He allows some senior guys to really establish their own fiefdoms. That's how he runs the state. That's his choice. So all these things have consequences, personally and politically. I think in the system, and this is to me the key point, I think Zuma has had an unfair press. First of all, his traditional elements, I think that's part of the repertoire that should be legitimate. And the business press, mostly in white or Indian hands, have not given him a fair reading there. But the point is that they've tried to ascribe all the ills of South Africa to Zuma. And many of the issues can only arise because the ANC at present works in a certain way. It has a non-pluralist culture. It's been a one-party dominant state for 25 years. There's a reason why an English gentleman would say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? This has always been the case in Europe. It's the case in Asia. It's no different in Africa. So systemically, if you don't have good checks and balances, or if they are hollowed out, actively, deliberately, by the ANC as part of a policy, then that has consequences. It means the requirements from your leaders are higher if there are no checks and balances, and if they don't fulfill, it will be even worse. So I think it's, even if you would have a person with more integrity and perhaps a greater leadership style, it would cause problems because the checks and balances are gone. I live in the Netherlands. I can tell you personally, my learning curve, if checks and balances are affected, it goes in the wrong way. So this is a human universal thing. I think that's where the system has failed us, or has failed many people in South Africa, and will continue to fail us until we solve that. So it's a political culture inside the liberation movement. It is the incompetent cadre deployment outside, throughout the services. It is an unequal playing field now, politically. You can't change much anymore. And an uneven economic playing field. The cronies dominate, not the most competent best businesses. Partially, not wholly. Everything that I described is partial, but the point is we are in a different situation compared to 94. And that different situation has made all the difference.
Thank you. Are there any questions that people want to ask? I've seen Tom raise his hand.
Sure. What you tell us about Zuma is intriguing, and I think there are lots of things that make me think that the former American president did exactly the same. And the big difference between the way you described Zuma and the way he worked and the way now we will look back at Trump's administration is that for narrative producers, you need narrative communicators. And narrative communicators mean you control the press, you create a lot of antipathy to the journalists who are not aligning with you, you control the TV stations, you control social media. That's left out from your talk. How did Zuma try to control social media, control the TV systems, control radio, and especially control journalism in the 9 years he was in power?
Yeah, thank you, Ton. I think I will emphasize everything I described about South Africa indicates that's a partial picture. He wasn't all powerful, he couldn't affect everything. That said, let's start with the SABC, the national broadcaster. That broadcaster, unfortunately, like most public institutions in South Africa, during Zuma's time experienced political patronage, intimidation, journalists being told inside the SABC what they should be broadcasting and not. What they did in addition was that the oversight authority of the SABC previously was with Parliament. Under Zuma, it shifted so that it became cabinet, not Parliament. So much closer, tighter rein on the public broadcaster. That includes the radio stations that transmit in the 9 indigenous languages. So he really had a very powerful grasp of it. We also saw that the business media, as I've described, the ANC has tried to establish a competitor there with some money from the pension fund, some money from Chinese agencies. As a alternative media, it has not worked completely. It's not that profitable, but most media in South Africa these days are not that very profitable. But that has also played a role. The business media did, and other media, opposition, let's say pro-opposition media, have been a very critical force and a real force in South Africa in terms of uncovering scandals, delivering criticism, having editorials, etc. The problem, of course, is manifold. First of all, if I'm sitting in the Eastern Cape in a rural area, do I listen to these business people, business media? No, I don't. I don't even read it. If I'm sitting in KwaZulu-Natal, I'll be listening to my local radio, right? In addition, we have, as you know, Stephen Ellis's concept of pavement radio, I think hugely underestimated, but also under-researched in South Africa. So I think that's a gap. But I think that will tell us that many of the popular and populist themes of Zuma emerged in that media. That would be my hypothesis. So a critical media, open spaces, but in terms of the state media and some aligned ones, I would say quite controlled or sufficiently controlled. What struck me is that despite all the criticism of Zuma, the clear effect of him and his closest circles policies, the ANC has been time and again voted back into power. By now, I think they represent something like 35, under his rule, 35% of the registered voters. Or that's not too big a portion, but they've been voted back. So that means that the actual effect of a critical media on actual political events and the reasons why people would vote for people, of course, are not really covered by media criticism. So can have critical media, people will still vote the same guys into power for other reasons. And that is something else that I think need to be researched. I hope that answers your question.
All right. So on which note, we thank Heinrich for his presentation and his enlightenment about South Africa. So we can do two things. We can check if Abel is able to come back, and if he's still facing problems, then I'm afraid that I would have to continue with the presentation. Abel, I cannot see him on my dashboard anymore.
I think he should be in a position to come back. I think he's changed his provider.
Okay.
He told me he's changed his provider, so I don't know. He's not on the.
Yes, he's not online just yet. He's not online. Okay, so maybe I would take over and also present. That means that we might have to run over by about 10 to 15 minutes or so. I will take over and present my work as well, and then in case Abel comes back, then we would have to make room for him to finish what he started. Okay, so I take over and I share my screen. Unlike many papers we've seen so far, my paper is on financial market regulation and adoption of international standards on regulation of capital, and to what extent companies listed on local exchanges in developing countries in general will benefit from the use of internationally recognized financial reporting standards. So quite broadly speaking, what are these standards? It's a uniform reporting language by multinational firms to make sure that it doesn't matter where you sit in the world. If you sit in Bermuda and I sit in Congo, you should be able to understand the financial reports that I provide to you as a way of enticing you to invest in Congo. Yeah, if you sit in the US and you want to invest in Botswana, you just want to understand that the accountants there have done a good job by preparing financial statements that you can understand. And of course, what is the import of that? The import of that is that, as markets become globalized, capital flows become easy to go from. Capital can roam the world and is seeking for better returns, and therefore investors should be able to take risk-adjusted decisions based on where they put their money. It doesn't matter which country it is. A little bit background about these standards. In the 1970s, every country did whatever they wanted in terms of reporting. Accountants sitting in their offices could write up books and nobody could understand them. So if you come from abroad and you want to invest in a local country, you probably have to invest time, money, to either pay people to interpret them in a way that will let you understand them. And this became costly in terms of doing business locally. And so in 1973, a bunch of accountants across the world and in Europe came together to form the International Accounting Standards Board with the idea that we can have a uniform set of financial reports speared by the globalization of businesses, multinational firms that went abroad to invest, to open subsidiaries, wanted to minimize the cost of preparing financial statements also, because you cannot follow every rule that is prevailing locally when you go there. And so it became apparent that we needed a uniform system or mechanism of letting accountants report and to let investors be aware of how these reports should be read. So that led to the formation of the International Accounting Standards Board. Fast forward from 1973 up to 2000, the Standards Board was transformed into the International Financial Reporting Foundation, the IFRS Foundation, located in London. It's a non-profit private organization with 19 board members who are typically retired accountants or accountants who are fed up with writing books, and they want, instead of writing books, they want to write the rules that govern the writing of the books. And so these 19 middle-aged to almost retiring accountants, they provide the groundwork for companies to follow and report that kind of financial reporting standards. Now, as we speak, about 140 countries have already adopted the standards, which is good, but it also poses a problem because not every country will benefit from it because there are unique circumstances that govern every country's financial architecture. And so writing rules that, it's just like trying to say an elephant and a monkey should climb a tree because they both have 4 legs, right? So the monkey can climb the tree anyway, but the elephant just cannot. It's not possible, right? So although they have a criteria, which is there to say, you have 4 legs, I also have 4 legs, you have a tail, I have a tail, you have a nose, I have a nose, let's both climb a tree. It's not possible. The elephant cannot climb that tree, yeah? So one rule fits all approach doesn't necessarily benefit everybody. Okay, so our idea here is to examine to what extent the bigger players, how we can separate the elephants from the monkeys to see, do the monkeys benefit the same way the elephants would benefit, or if these rules are more for the elephants than the monkeys? That's our theory here. And so we decided to look into the economic consequences of adopting the standards. The idea is that if you use the same set of rules for every country, we all benefit. Information flow would minimize risk in investment and therefore lead to positive economic consequences or better returns. And these better returns will lead to a lower cost of capital because of information risks being lowered. In the end, the cost of doing business, which is the cost of capital, will be minimized. Okay, so having given the background to what we want to study here, we really want to study, do we see a decline in cost of doing business if all firms from either developing countries or developed countries adopt the same standards? Yeah, prior literature documented has shown that yes, there is some kind of positive effect for the big players. We've seen, we've seen papers in Europe that have examined European countries in detail, and they are able to document that yes, once firms adopt IFRS, their cost of capital declines. Yeah, so in other words, there is some kind of informational benefits here, and therefore countries benefit from adoption. We've seen papers that have been written in disclosures that also document weak evidence to the fact that Even if a country is able to adopt them, but your institutions are weak, then yeah, you will not benefit anyway because you don't have people to police them, you don't have auditors to check the numbers, you don't have capital market regulators or exchanges to check to make sure that the right thing is done, and therefore you will not be profiting from the adoption of these standards. However, fewer studies have subjected the same research question in developing countries, and we just wanted to be able to show that yes, developing countries also have some kind of either they have benefits in adopting them, or maybe it just doesn't matter because the rules were written for the big players anyway, not for the smaller players. So we hypothesized in several ways. We hypothesized that if you adopt these standards, your cost of doing business would decline. And in this case, we separated it into two forms. One, what is the cost of doing business? Your cost of doing business is what investors would require you to pay them in return for investing in your business. But that's not the only source of financing to do your business. We also have debt providers, right? You borrow money from the banks, you borrow from other sources in capital markets, you issue bonds to be able to finance your business. In Europe and in developed capital markets, it's quite common to use debt financing. But in developing countries, it's close to impossible to issue a bond that will be well received locally, let alone internationally. So we wanted to see whether or not debt financing also plays a role in the benefit that developing countries can accrue from adopting international standards. So we came up with a couple of hypotheses. One about the cost of equity, whether or not firms would benefit from that, and one is about the cost of debt, whether or not firms would benefit from that. We also looked at, some kind of in detail looking at whether institutions play a role in whether or not companies or countries adopting it will benefit. For example, your governance structure, right? So do you have a good governance system that can make sure that capital investment will really be used for its purpose? And second of all, investors can be assured and go to bed that your governance structure is somehow protecting their investments. And hypothesis 3 and 4, we wanted to look at to what extent do investor protection play a role. I mean, of course, the larger argument has always been that if I go to a country that my investment is not protected by any law, then two things can happen. It's either I will not invest or I will demand a higher return for my investment because I want to be sure that I either protect myself or I take the risk, but in return for the risk that I'm taking, I expect to be compensated more for that risk. And of course, that was the hypothesis 5 that we came up with. So how do we measure that? We measured that in several proxies. I don't want to bore you with the measurement and proxies, but we did a firm level analysis in the financial report, and we did a country level analysis of debt, government bonds, use that to price our cost of equity. So we separated our sample into 2, developing countries and developed countries, and we pitched them against each other. We ran a difference in difference analysis, and in the end, we made some predictions. So these predictions in the regression, our main variables of interest are more about the type of economy. Are you a developed or developing country? Your governance structure. We used a corruption perception index as a way of measuring whether or not it's a good place to do business. And we also did have what we call the investor protection or minority protection variable, which is a variable that measures to what extent minority shareholders will be protected or their investments will be protected in a particular localized economy. So we basically regress our cost of capital variable, either cost of equity or cost of debt over the adoption variable and these variables that we have just mentioned to see whether or not they play a significant role. What did we find? Well, we find some kind of interesting result. We did find that on the whole, mandatory adoption for developing countries tend to be the larger beneficiaries of adopting international standards. Why? If you take countries that in Africa, in developing countries in general, they don't have their own accounting rule system. In other words, they don't have the power or they don't have the infrastructure to set their own accounting standards. And therefore, they don't invest so much money, which is costly to write out these rules. They only just take the rules that have been adopted somewhere else and bring it into their localized economy. And that tends to prove that yes, they are able to profit from it immediately, which is in larger variance to what they used to do in the past. If you compare that to mandatory adopters in developed countries, what you did find is that they profit a little bit less because most of these standards are not really that new. They used to have it anyway, and so over time, if you overnight switch into a new system, the incremental value is really very small. We did some analysis on our, pre and post adoption, whether or not after you adopt, do you see a decline in cost of capital? In general, we are able to say that yes, after the adoption, you have a decline in cost of capital, but this decline is more pronounced for developing countries than it is for developed countries. We checked our governance variables as well. We are able to document that countries that have strong governance system able to monitor and implement mechanisms to monitor implementation tend to have a good benefit of adopting the standards. Countries that are weak and they have pervasive corruption, typically, yeah, you might adopt it anyway, but the benefit will be very, very less. We checked our cost of debt variable for both developed and developing countries. We find, contrary to literature, that in developing countries, cost of debt tends to go up instead of coming down. Why? The debt capital market in developing countries is very less developed. As I did indicate, interest rates are really very high in developing countries. Government treasury bills as a risk-free mechanism is really very high compared to developing countries where compared to developed country counterparts where risk-free rates are now even in negatives. If you take Switzerland, for example, if you take Germany, for example, treasury bills return rate, the 30-year bonds are about historically close to zero or even in negatives in some instances. And therefore, they are unable to profit as a result of any further decline in developing countries because they miss out the point on it. Yeah. We checked out the investor protection mechanism. We also did see that countries that have a mechanism to protect minority investors typically benefit from the standard adoption than countries that have weak mechanism. So in conclusion, what did we say? We say that countries that have not adopted the standards yet should take important clues from this, not only in terms of accounting standards, but also other capital market regulatory standards like auditing standards, like banking regulation, like capital flows regulation, foreign direct investment. All of these standards coming from the West, coming from developed countries that can flow into local environment and spear economic growth should be looked at again to see whether or not there is some kind of overflow benefit of adopting them first, and second, what institutions should be strengthened to profit from this adoption process. I think I've exhausted my 15 minutes. I will now give the chance for questions and interaction. I've seen 3 hands on my screen. I've seen Katarina, Tom, Uche, and Henrik. Okay, maybe why don't we start from Henrik on the top.
Okay, Solomon, thank you. It's very interesting. I'm not an accounting expert, so I'm trying to find my way here. But what I wondered about was, how do you explain that in the wrap-up, number 2, governance quality is less important than previously suggested? What do you see there happening? And then perhaps linked to that, the concept of opportunity costs in this whole issue, because even though you may have a lot of information about capital, you may want to allocate it elsewhere in Africa or whatever. Those 2 things, governance quality and opportunity cost. What would be your comments about that?
Yeah, so governance quality, in this case, for developing countries, we've always argued that governance quality very much determines whether or not implementing a foreign standard or a foreign rule or foreign set of policies will very much determine to what extent you would profit from it. And of course, our prediction was that, yes, if you have a very poor governance quality, then rest assured you would have, I mean, our prediction was really way in line with countries that have pervasive corruption. If you take South Africa as an example, the corruption perception index indicate that there was a high prevalence of corruption and a poor governance quality. But it turns out that our prediction, the results was less than we initially predicted. That is accounted for the fact that the market is relatively developed and information flow is now becoming more and more available. And therefore, although governance quality is low, investors are able to filter through the information provided by the market and put in a discount. Yeah, they discount what you have already provided at some level because we don't believe everything you give, but at least we know that, yeah, with IFRS mechanism in place, we can always have access to information. Yeah,
sure.
Second, regarding your question on opportunity cost, right? So the opportunity cost is if I have to allocate capital between South Africa and Nigeria, and I just don't know what the Nigerian guys are doing in terms of reporting, then I might either continue to allocate the capital anyways, but in return, I will demand a higher return. Yeah, I will demand a higher return. Or I will just not do it. I will not take that decision because I don't know what they are doing there. But at least with IFRS, it mediates this problem because it helps you to think about, at least even if the Nigerians are misreporting, IFRS gives a foundation, a basis for you to build on to make that financial decision. Yeah.
Thank you. So
overall, it's still a good thing that they adopted. It's just more important that the governance and institutions would support the adoption process. Uche, you need to unmute yourself. We cannot hear you.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Solomon, for this presentation. Personally, I struggle with this kind of research. And my concern is this. Let me explain. I started my career as a trainee accountant in what is now PricewaterhouseCoopers.
Yeah.
And in those days, I think one of the key things, one of the concerns I had was they used to bring a lot of standards from London for us about these international standards to adapt to local companies. And it was clear to all of us then that there was a clear mismatch between these standards and the local companies. Mm-hmm. Okay, so at an early age, I started questioning the utility value of these international standards. Forget before we start putting the numbers on it, on these local companies. So my concern from then, and I think if you look at the numbers in Africa, especially, at least I speak for maybe West Africa, where I know quite a lot about. If you look at the numbers, things have not really materially changed in terms of numbers and comparisons. And then if you force local companies to, or if you encourage or goad them into adopting this kind of standards, then I begin to wonder about the utility value. I mean, I respect your numbers, I respect your number crunching, right? But from a practical perspective, and that's where I want to get your opinion, then I wonder about the utility value of these standards clearly in areas where they rarely match. Because, I mean, a lot of it is total mismatch, about 70–80% for most of the companies who we are. And then if you look at it, for instance, if you look at company law, for instance, if you look at what is an SME in the UK and compare it to what is a multinational in Nigeria, you will find out that a lot of SMEs in the UK, which are by law not even required to have their accounts audited. Okay, they can of course seek an audit if they are going to approach a bank for a loan or something. But by law, they are not required. A lot of them, the turnover, the requirement, they are far bigger than a lot of the quoted companies in Africa. And then a situation where now African companies, in the Companies Act, almost every company is now required to adopt IFRS. Mm-hmm. And I find that troubling. And then, of course, that will go to the kind of results you get from for me, fundamentally question the kind of results you get from this your number crunching. And I wanted to get your opinion on that.
Well, Uche, that's a very good observation. In terms of numbers and size, that's the entire argument we've put up. We pitched the paper, and we did say that, and I did use the analogy of the elephant and the monkey by the way the company law defines it. The company law would say, what is an animal? What is a four-legged animal? A four-legged animal, all four-legged animals should be able to do this, this or that, right? That's it. That's the premise of IFRS. And the fact that your economic state will determine very much whether or not these standards are suitable for you or not is at the heart of this paper. And so what did we argue? We argued that for the large part, these countries that are in developing parts of the world, these standards were originally not designed for their purpose, right? So if you take even the relative size of the local stock markets or the number of companies listed, if you go to Botswana, you have about 12 companies listed. Some countries don't even have stock markets. And for those which even have stock markets, some are really, really, really very small, very small. In our sample in Africa, for example, we have 4 or 5 countries standing out: South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria. These are or to a larger extent, Tunisia stand out in terms of the value of their capital market. And these are the companies that typically tend to profit from the adoption of these standards. However, having realized this problem, the IASB came up with an alternative, and they designed what we call the IFRS for SMEs, IFRS for small and medium scale enterprises, with the hope that companies that are really not that big and they have, like, say, 20 employees or 40 employees or 50 employees with capital less than $200,000 or $1 million can go and adopt the smaller version or the abridged version of the standards to make sure that at least they still have the basic requirement of what is defining I would say the smaller principles of accounting in there. For example, what is an asset? An asset is anything that is an investment that into a physical sort of like a product that can then lead into you being able to generate income from it. It shouldn't matter. That definition shouldn't matter whether you are a big company or a small company. Yeah, an asset is always an asset. A liability is always a liability. But in the largest frame of things like financial instrument or anything that is very complex to apply in the case of a small company, they removed all of those from IFRS for SMEs to allow smaller companies to be able to deal with that, right? And of course, I share your concern that these standards are not applicable in the local context of some countries, and I do agree with that. And that's why some countries have resisted the temptation of adopting them. If you see Africa, only 33 countries have adopted the standards. And if you take most of Africa, you say 70% of the continent don't even have stock markets. And for those that even have stock markets, only a few of them can really comprehend or have the manpower to comprehend the complexities in these standards to adopt them. Yeah.
So just a little follow-up. So I think I like this your analysis. Only 33 countries have adopted it. So 33 countries. So we're talking about 70 something% have adopted it, while 70 something% don't even have stock exchanges.
Exactly.
It's an interesting analysis.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I think thank you.
It's an intriguing paper. And to follow your analogy of the animals, they're monkeys and elephants, and they are led by these old bulls from London. Yeah. There's a dragon in the room now.
Yes. True.
My big question is, does this story have any relevance for the Chinese banks and Chinese companies? And an additional question is, do you see that Chinese accountants are now trying to also get some say or some influence in this IFRS mechanism and in the people more or less designing the rules of the game?
Yes, Tom, thank you for your question. Okay, so yes, it has practical relevance, and yes, the Chinese are getting involved. So the practical relevance, if I get your question Sorry, Tom, can you repeat your first question?
So, do you see that these rules of the game also play a role for the Chinese banks and Chinese companies? So do they more or less follow the same accountancy principles and make their books also align with these principles from London?
Yes, yes. So the truth of the matter is in terms of Africa, we've done a separate paper where we try to see whether foreign direct investments play a role in the way that these rules are applied. And we also saw, we looked at where this money comes from. Unfortunately, the Chinese way of foreign direct investment doesn't come through equity markets in Africa. In other words, they are not going up buying companies, listing them in the stock market, or investing through companies listed in stock markets in Africa. Rather, the foreign direct investment from China to Africa comes through local or smaller pockets of foreign direct investment or smaller companies. So for example, China wants to open smaller mines. In mining sector, they put money in a briefcase. They fly to Africa. They set up the mine or the operation, the farm, whatever they want to do, and then in the end, the money flows through export and back to China. So you are unable to document the role of Chinese FDI through equity capital markets. Note that our analysis here was only for listed companies. Only for listed companies. We were not able to track down smaller companies that are not required to even use these rules in the first place, and to what extent they have any linkage with China. Yeah. Second, Chinese banks by default are regulated, and therefore they are required to apply the adapted version of IFRS. In other words, IFRS in China works, but then they have changed the rules to meet the Chinese local rules. So in other words, you can say there's IFRS in China anyway, but it's an adapted version of IFRS. Yeah, it's an adapted version of IFRS. Globally, when these Chinese banks go abroad, they apply these rules, but that's only for the bigger ones that go abroad, like the International Bank of China, that happens to be the largest bank in the world by asset size right now. And they meet the rules because they want to go abroad to invest their capital and invest in larger companies. And so there we can see some kind of relation here. But beyond that, the rest of the Chinese companies, as you may know, you probably wouldn't even know what they are doing. You don't even, apart from the name you might understand, but you wouldn't know what they are doing. So it's difficult to even check the books to know whether or not they apply IFRS in detail. But on the Accounting Standards Board level, China has a representation there. Why? Because they want to be reckoned as a global force in capital allocation. They want to be at the forefront as well, so that they can take steps to also attract capital locally. As you may know, they have created a Series B stock market for foreign firms to come to China to invest. And these Series B firms are now required to follow not only Chinese law, but also IFRS. And so there's a relation here, and they don't want to be left out in that.
Thank you. Very encouraging. Very good. Thank you.
Hello, Katarina?
Yes, hello, I hear you. Actually, I was just applauding before. I didn't really have a question, so okay. Yeah, sorry. But thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting.
Good. Well, we've exhausted the time for my side. I don't know whether Abel is able to join now with a good internet connection. Abel?
Yeah, I've just spoken to him, and I think he's trying to join, and I think he's. I've just spoken to him, and he's trying to join. So if you can give him a couple of minutes.
Yeah. Okay. I can see he's here, but I don't know. On the other hand, Uche, you are a co-author on the paper. You probably could take over from him.
Yeah, I mean, I can just essentially finish up the. I mean, I haven't prepared to do it. Essentially, I can finish up the conclusion or the findings of the paper, especially based on the case studies that we had. I can do that, but I think Abel is the lead in the paper, so and he's prepared for the presentation. But if not, then I can use a couple of minutes and summarize the findings.
Yeah. Why don't you get on to it while we wait for him to join?
Okay. Okay. I mean, I can do that. And okay. So essentially, what we essentially did, we looked at two main case studies, and we were looking at cement companies and how they operate in the environmental dynamics of Nigeria. And then we looked at the two main cement companies. We looked at Dangote Cement, and also we looked at Lafarge, which is of course one of the biggest cement companies in the world, but which used to be the biggest cement company in Nigeria until recently when Dangote took over. So we looked at the two. And then what we found in terms of their environmental dynamics and how they apply to the local environment was that the Dangote cement, for instance, still they use extensively, they use coal. And this is where I think one of the things we found quite interesting, they use coal a lot in their production. And it's interesting that the factories were built by World Bank loans from the International Finance Corporation, and they had environmental analysis, environmental clearance that required that they use clean energy. So they were actually built to use gas, but for various reasons, Dangote in the annual report, they claim well that their gas pipelines were continuously being vandalized and the gas supply was not stable. So they found a cheaper way, which was coal, which is of course far more cheaper than gas. So they even make more profits than coal, but which falls below the international standards. Then you compare it with Lafarge, which essentially what they use gas. And essentially they use gas for all their plants. And that is of course based on their international standards, because Lafarge all over the world have committed to the use of clean energy. And in fact, they've eliminated the use of coal internationally. So here you have two multinational companies, one local and one, and that was what Abel meant when he said, if that it doesn't whether you are multinational, foreign multinational or local multinational, was not necessarily an important factor in that. So what we actually found was that being a foreign multinational, actually, the control by your foreign headquarters or foreign affiliates could actually help you enhance and apply better standards in the local environment, compared with Dangote, which of course is a multinational based in Nigeria, which extensively uses coal. So there's no international control, and it has not yet committed to any global standards about the use of global energy, about the use of clean energy in its international operations. So I think that was our major conclusion from the paper.
Okay, thank you so much. Are there any questions? But before that, I might have my own question here, Uche. In terms of climate change and the rhetoric on CO2 emission, it has always been skewed towards the fact that the bigger players can, they have this kind of ideology that they can produce more CO2, but we, the smaller players, anyways, cannot produce CO2. Talking about the Paris climate COP2, the COP27 sort of agreement. And if you see the distribution across Africa, some people say we must also sign up to the agreement, whereas we produce less CO2, yet we are asked to comply to some of these clean energy or clean, I would say, sustainability agreement. So what is your take on this divide? Is it more like that the industrialized world can continue to run their coal plants everywhere, and whilst they are asking us to use solar panels for installation?
Yeah, I think in absolute terms, you are correct. In absolute terms, multinational developed countries produce more CO2 than, but essentially what these agreements are about firm practices at firm levels. And one of the things our research has shown is that at firm levels, it does not really follow that. It does not really follow so, but in absolute terms, of course, in Nigeria, how many cement companies do you have? What is the cement capacity, for instance? And then you look at other smaller countries, and other industries. So in absolute terms, yes, we do not produce, African countries do not produce as much CO2 as developed countries. But at the firm level, the reality is that most of the foreign firms have actually committed to, and from our studies, for instance, and not just for cement also, but also if you look at the oil industry, for instance, because have actually committed to eradicating CO2 emissions. Because if I am aware that a lot of oil companies, for instance, like Total, for instance, operating all over the world, that CO2 issues has become central even in the evaluation of their chairmen and chief executives. So you can see there is a clear movement towards that internationally. So it's not rhetoric. And that actually influences their practice in developing countries, even if it increases their cost of production. Because there is also this fear, there is this great fear about what happens. There could be repercussions in the Western world, which is, of course, where they have their major markets. But multinational companies in developing countries do not have such restraints. And that is essentially what these are. So being local really does not necessarily mean that you're acting in the local, you must act in the local interest of the local economy. That's the point we make.
Okay. Are there any other further observations or questions? I see Eric
Yes.
have a hand up.
Yes, I'm interested in the following. If there's a stereotype, the stereotype is that Africa has a lot of sunshine, and therefore solar panels is the market of the future. So, and we are sitting in winter here, and so we must know what we are missing, right? How do you see that? So, but also slightly more broadly, if sustainable issues, green energy becomes an issue in Nigeria or elsewhere, which parts of the market do you think would it appear first? And then there's a second thing that is very, very much more generic, and that is, you know, when I discussed Zuma or looked into Zuma, what I found was families feel they have an obligation to each other also in politics, right? That's normal. The clan does, the tribe does, the people have that obligation. Then there comes a point where it becomes corruption, not to the outside world, but to the people who are involved in this. Yeah. So this, what we call new patrimonialism and corruption. Here, it's often seen as the same. I don't agree. Among the people, there will be a line. And how do you see this line in the case of Dangote? Can you sense that there's, of course, this network of social obligations, and do you think there's a corruption element? But secondly, where would the market then start? I hope it's clear, these two questions.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think let's start. I think there's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I think that's where the center point is, this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, if somebody does not have accommodation, basic things to eat, clearly climate is not the thing in his mind. That's clear. Okay, so irrespective of the pollution, I mean, you go to Dangote, says he built cement roads, which of course we know cause more pollution than bitumen roads. Okay, so people are just happy to use those cement roads. Nobody is talking about it. It's not an issue. It is not an issue. Pollution is clearly not an issue. If you go to South Korea, for instance, and then they tell you, no, you can't do this. You can't build cement roads. And then they look at the emissions. They've gotten to a much higher level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think that's the kind of dynamics that a lot of these companies take advantage of when they operate in Africa. Okay, so in terms of electricity, in terms of what's sustainable energy, really, I mean, Africa has a lot of solar, which of course is totally unutilized, which is a shame, really, because and I think, in my view, I think solar fits the African environment, and sub-Saharan African environment, far better, because I think one of the problems in Africa is in the lack of this expertise of managing complex integrated systems. So if you look at the mobile phone, it's successful in Africa because it's units, and it's all units, and then you have this big mass somewhere, but it's all been unitized. And if you look at solar, for instance, it has that capacity to be developed along maybe building lines, village lines, house lines. And that is the kind of thing that will kickstart Africa. Africa will never be kickstarted by a complex procedures or processes, integrated power. No, that is not the way to go. I think solar is the way to go, but that has to come from Africa. Now, I'll give you an analogy. Several years ago, I was doing my sabbatical in Germany, and we went to a plant, a wind power plant in Germany. And essentially, sorry, let me answer Abel, please, just 1 minute. Let me just answer Abel. Abel? Hello? Oh, it's cut. So we went to a wind power plant, and they were experimenting with it. This was about several years ago, about 98, 98 or so. They were experimenting with wind power plant. And one of the things that shocked me was that it was an experiment, yet the production of that experiment was higher than what the entire Nigeria's energy production was.
Wow.
Okay, so that's why I always believe that the wastages in Africa has to be changed in Africa from the inside of Africa. Okay, because I mean, it's not about going and signing agreements with American energy companies. That clearly is not the way to go, in my view.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions, observations? Okay, so I mean, as the moderator, I mean, I want to summarize, and then Uche would give the closing remarks. I think we are already above time by 15 minutes. It's been a very productive session, starting with the first paper that we had today about currency unions in Africa and the future of the ECO and the future of France colonization, colonial influence on the monetary union. That remains to be seen, and to see how the role of the ECO in Africa will turn out and the influence of China. We then moved on into the concept of an individual character or individual personality developing around a political economic perspective in South Africa. We saw a paper on the role of climate change and to what extent cement production and the role of sustainable development occurs in Nigeria. And we concluded on the session with financial market integration and to what extent international rules can mediate the cost of doing business in developing countries. So overall, we've covered quite a ground, and I believe that it was very productive. And I would like to thank all of you for joining and for submitting the papers and being able to be here to present your work. So over to you, Uche.
Yeah, I mean, let me add my word of thank you to you, and especially I thank Solomon. Thank you, Solomon, for shepherding this whole panel. You've done an excellent job. The way you've arranged it, we are really grateful, and I think you've brought out a lot of the important points in it. It's a shame that our colleague Abel has these technical issues, because I think, I mean, he presented some and I tried to fill in, but he's really the big, using the African terminology, he's really the big man in this area. And I'm sure his presence will have been far much more than I did. So it's a shame that it happened, but I think the paper is available for us to all read, and we think it's an important paper, important contribution. And let me also thank all other participants. And I mean, I think for submitting your papers and for such an excellent production. It's been, for me personally, I've learned a lot from this panel, and I'm sure that from the questions we also had, I'm sure we've all enjoyed this panel. Our goal forward is also to continue these discussions in other kinds of fora. And I think, and I'm happy that I'm now working closely with Solomon in bringing out this whole African perspective, especially from an economics and business perspective, which you work on, and then Abel, of course, and then now we have new contacts in South Africa, working on South Africa. So thank you, everybody, and then let us all keep the flag flying. Yes.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. All right. Nice to see everyone, and
Goodbye.
bye.